Thank you all so much for joining. I'm Sarah Montross, Senior Curator at deCordova Sculpture Park and Museum. deCordova is now part of the Trustees of Reservations, which is Massachusetts' oldest and largest preservation and conservation organization with over 118 properties across the state. And I'm really delighted and really honored to be hosting our first Zoom conversation with artist Saul Melman, whose installation, Transcendent installation, is on view in the park. It's one of the park's most beloved pieces, and it's called Best of All Possible Worlds. So many of you will have been to the park and seen this arrangement of 8 cast doors, and they're arranged in the exact configuration or formation and dimension of a Brooklyn apartment that is in fact the artist's apartment. In addition to being a talented artist, Saul is also an emergency room physician. So he works within a hospital in Brooklyn and has been working on the front line of the COVID crisis, since its impact in New York. And so I'm just really overwhelmed with gratitude that you could take time out of your schedule and what you're processing to talk about your work today. And actually the conversation came up because Saul wrote to myself and John Ravenel, our director, as you were just struck by the fact that your installation has much different resonance now that we are all home, now that we're all living in a domestic space and thinking about domesticity so much differently. And so you were having new ideas, and I thought it would be a great chance for us to talk publicly on not only about the new resonance of your installation, but also your practices and your dual practices as an artist and a doctor, when so much of our dialogue right now and thought process is about how to maintain an identity that is aware of public health while also living and being creative. And so you're a perfect person to speak to and to hear from. I wanted to mention too, the park, if you're not aware, the park itself at deCordova is now open to the public. We have time ticket entries. So in order to get access, you can go to the website and purchase tickets that way. There is limited entry, so it's meant to be one that is a safe way for people to enter our grounds. We're not open to the public indoors yet, but we're having a lot of conversations about the best ways for our galleries to reopen, and we don't have a date yet of when that will happen. But we can all say that the outdoor space is what we most desire right now, I think, for most of us. And so again, that's another reason to talk with Saul, and then hopefully people can make their visits to deCordova or come back. So Saul, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. And you are in the apartment that is based off of your installation, correct?
That's true, that's true. And I just want to say thank you again for arranging this event, along with the deCordova and the trustees.
You're welcome. I'll mention too, so we are speaking for about 30-35 minutes. Then we have a short period of time for questions and Q&A. And the way to submit a question, if you would like, is at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A function, and we ask that you type in the question. You can do that while we're talking or during the Q&A period, and my colleague Elizabeth will be able to monitor those and read out a few. We'll see how many we get and what there is time for. But Saul, before talking about Best of All Possible Worlds, I wanted to just start off the conversation with how you came to practice as both a doctor and an artist. Where did this begin for you?
Oh, well, so initially I thought of the paths of being both an artist and a doctor as very different. In college, I was both pre-med and a studio art major. And by the end of college, I thought that I would have to choose one or the other because they were different paths. And my father, who is a scientist, both a scientist and a doctor, and I grew up in a home that was had a lot of enthusiasm for the sciences. That path was familiar and one that I enjoyed. And I didn't really know very many artists at the time, and I didn't really know how one became an artist in the world. So at that time, I chose to go to medical school, although I had thought of perhaps going to art school, but I went to medical school. And then after those 4 years, I went to post-grad training. I became an ER doctor, and during that time was starting to take some art classes. And then after I was done with my post-grad training, I started to slowly return to art making. And by chance, I met the artist Ursula von Rijdingsvaart, a sculptor who also has some work at the deCordova.
Great.
And she took me under her wing and allowed me to intern in her studio for a year or so. And it was through her and watching her and her relationships with materials and how she ran her studio that I could start to envision how I might have a path forward as an artist. So I started to make art more in earnest, and then I went back and got my MFA. And about 15 years later, so now that I've been practicing as an artist and a doctor, I actually realized that these paths are more similar than I had previously envisioned.
Yeah, and so what do you mean by that? What are some continuities that you see between doctoring and working as an artist?
Sure. Well, as both an artist and a doctor, I'm present and watching these materials in transformation and watching them evolve over time, and there's a story that's unfolding. So my role in both is to really observe and to pay attention to that unfolding narrative and to figure out which parts of that story are most important. In the emergency room, I'm meeting a stranger, someone for the first time when their material is spinning out of control. And my role as an ER doctor is to restore order. In the arena of the studio, what I do is I often experiment with new materials or methods of making or materials that are difficult to control. And what I do is I create a state of disorder. And then what I try to do is capture these threshold moments in time. So another thing that is also similar between the two practices is that both of them are very social. I make work in order to share it with the viewer. And I think about how the viewer might experience the work. And then also, obviously, being a physician is also very social with the doctor-patient interaction.
I mean, I think of that too in the case of your work, both as an artist and as a doctor, that this aspect of transformation is so key, whether it's in your park installation where light becomes activated and it's like almost an alchemical transformation, whereas in your work as a doctor, some of your patients will be, considering their own mortality as they're worried about their situation. And so that transformation, even from life to death and passage of a different kind, is really resonant. And that is something that you are kind of you are occupying those hinges, that hinge space in a way, that liminal space. You've talked about your work as an artist and as a doctor, sort of as a mediator, right?
Right.
And
so that reminds me of, one important experience I had when I was in my early 20s that's really foundational for a lot of the ideas that I explore in my artwork and also as my practice as a physician. And that was when I was in my early 20s, in the very beginning of med school, I created this independent study program where I went and lived with this indigenous group in the rainforest in northern Ecuador. And I was studying with a botanist, an ethnobotanist from the New York Botanical Gardens, and had this opportunity to work with curanderos, with these medicinal plants. But one day I had the opportunity to take a walk alone in the rainforest, and with the exception of the lone footpath, there was no other hint of human presence. So it was this unmediated, immersive experience with the rainforest, and just surrounded by the churning cycle of growth and decay. And what happened is that I had this sudden visceral knowledge that I was both a fleeting part, but necessarily a part of this cyclical energy of a growth and decay. And I had this dissolution of self, the sensation of dissolution of self that was both thrilling and terrifying and yet beautiful. And then during that time, I also had the opportunity to witness and experience a traditional shaman healing ceremony where individuals from the indigenous group came from miles around and came to this doctor's home, which primarily involved a lot of hands-on sleight of hand work from the shaman in addition to chanting and singing. And what I became aware of during that time was how important ritual, belief, suggestion, empathy, and the power of storytelling. And that shaman was actually one of the more important teachers I had in med school. And those lessons I brought home and are very much a part of both my artwork and my medical practice.
That's really incredible to hear, because it's not so much what you're talking about, the diagnostic elements or learning the anatomy of the body, but so much is what you're talking about is about the aspects of care and presence and witnessing that someone might be needing at the same time. So I'd love to ask you more about that. I would love to know how you are approaching art making recently. And I know you were willing to share with us a work in progress, or maybe this is a finished work now. And I hope you could talk about it further
Sure. So yeah, this is a project that I finished just before the pandemic swept up in New York that I finished in February. This is a work that measures about 5 feet tall by 7 feet wide. It's a work of handmade paper. It was commissioned by NYU Langone to be cited within one of their spaces that's a radiology waiting room suite. So I was thinking about people sitting in this room waiting to have images taken from invisible structures from inside their body, and also the anxiety that someone might feel while they're sitting in that room. So what I did is I took images of scanning electron photographs, microscopic photographs of the microarchitecture of bone, and then abstracted it. And so this project was made at Dieudonné Paper Mill, which is a studio that I've been working at here in Brooklyn for over 5 years or so. And here I had the opportunity to work with master paper makers. And this project, the main material with this project is water with some dispersed pigments and various paper fiber pulps. And the way that we made this work was through special paper making techniques that are both additive and subtractive, which is much like bone itself, which is a living organ, which is in this constant state of remodeling through cellular activity of adding and subtracting.
And then
that's my most recent work that I've used my studio for. But since COVID's come, my studio has shut down, like it has for many other artists, so I don't have access to the studio, and that shut down in early March. And then after that, I think like most people, my main focus was my safety of myself and my family, and hunkering down and staying in place. But I also had was going to work, so I was leaving the confines of my house and the kind of relative eerie quiet of the neighborhood where I live, and then going into work, which was dramatically different, where we had patients who were coming in with COVID, and I was seeing patients who were severely ill with this disease that we really didn't know much about, and were kind of learning what to do as we went along. And during that time, the traditional way of showing work for artists has changed. The galleries are closed, so artists can't show their work in the gallery. So I had to think of new ways to make work that would not be the traditional outlet. So I did make a work that's going to be on the cover of a new book of poetry by the poet Joanna Klink, and that's coming out this summer. And then I've also started to reimagine a billboard project I did in Turin in 1950 that is this photographic tableau of these different hand gestures that I did, and reimagining that as a large-scale video that I would be able to show outside in a public space. Because during this time, thinking about my art, it's really kind of reinforced for me the importance of the experience of the viewer being able to physically see my work. And so I had to think of those other ways in which to show it. And in the way that it's also affected my work and kind of reinforced the importance for people to experience my work, it's also affected my medical practice in actually the same way. Before COVID came, I would go in, see a patient. If there wasn't a true emergency, sit down and have time to sit down and talk with them. And I certainly wouldn't be wearing 2 masks, a face shield, and multiple gowns like I am now. So what was once an interpersonal experience between me and the patients, which I really enjoyed, now it's one where, you know, the physicians, you know, there's a little bit of a concern that the patient might transmit something to them that could hurt them, and we're covered behind all these barriers of clothing. And in addition to that, we really spend less time with one another. We go into the room, get the information that we absolutely need, and then we leave. So it's changed the experience of being a physician as well.
Wow. That must be very difficult, but also necessary, I'm sure. And I'm hoping that that you're seeing a decrease of patients since the first and worst periods of this outbreak. I don't really know if that's true of where you're working.
Yeah, I mean, I live and work in New York City.
Great.
And so, you know, we were definitely hit hard here, but at least for now, it seems like the worst is over. There are definitely much fewer patients are coming in. But I think it's not only affected our practice as physicians and nurses, but also clearly, obviously changed the experience that, you know, patients have when they come into the emergency room, them not wanting to come into the emergency room in the first place. But when they do, you know, now there's this whole push for telemedicine, and people are seeing doctors, you know, through the computer. And so there's this whole, you know, it's less of an interpersonal direct experience, and now where things are mediated through the computer. And, you know, that kind of relates to back again to, you know, my practice as an artist, and my interest and desire for people to want to experience my work in person.
Exactly. And actually the next project we were going to talk about is actually one that came just before Best of All Possible Worlds. And we thought it was important to bring this up because, well, it's in New York, which is another good reason, but it's a project that captures the element of light, or it signaled for you why light could be a medium for you to harness. So I wondered if you could just quickly talk about this, and then we'll move into talking about Best of All Possible Worlds.
Yeah, so the interest of using light in Best of All Possible Worlds started with this project. This project that you're looking at is titled Central Governor. That's in the basement of MoMA PS1. And I was initially invited to make this work there. And when I went in 2010, and when I went to go visit the space, it was very dark and foreboding and kind of gloomy. And, you know, and I initially had the thought of maybe bringing in a piece of work that I had made into the studio and installing it in the space. But rather what I decided to do was to create a work using what was already there. And what was there was this huge, massive double door furnace, which is what you're seeing on the left. That was derelict and covered in chains and decades of rust and dirt and paint. And it was actually installed in the early 1900s, 1902, when the building was originally made, and, you know, heated the building. So, you know, I had this notion that I would somehow resurrect and transform this beautiful piece of steampunk equipment. So I did these 3 essential actions for making this piece. The first was to sandblast the entire face of the furnace down, including those pipeworks that you're seeing on the right side. So to clean it off down to its iron skin, which revealed all these like beautiful scars and marks on the surface of the iron that had accrued over a century or so. And then I scraped off some subterranean windows to allow in light to you know, illuminate the space. And then the third was that over the course of the exhibition, which was 6 months, I gilded the surface of the furnace by hand as viewers in the museum came through. But the way in which this piece relates to light and how it evolved into the making of Best Possible Worlds was that when I scraped off the windows to allow light into the space, it was really just to transform it from something that dark and gloomy and some place that you didn't really want to go inside into something that was more tranquil and welcoming. But what ended up happening were there's which you can see on the left side, were these dramatic beams of rectangular light that would start on one side of the room and then slowly move across the surface of the boiler and down onto the floor as the sun shifted, you know, in its trajectory across the sky. And then I ended up using light as a part of, or I integrated it into making the work itself. And it was during that time of making the work where I thought about, using natural sunlight as a means to investigate ideas about the cyclical energy and transformation and death. And so, that was really the stepping stone of what turned into my next project, which was Best of All Possible Worlds.
That's right. And so that very same action then becomes the primary one in a way, but with a very different resonance to be presented to see this work outdoors, almost like an inversion, I would say, of Central Governor into something that you see here. We wanted to try out something, or Saul actually offered to try out something with our audience rather than simply a conversation that's more talking heads. Saul wanted to lead a brief exercise that would maybe change how we're all experiencing this conversation. And so do you want to try that now, Saul? Or?
Sure, yeah, let's give it a go. So yeah, since we're all in our individual spaces together, and there are 100 or so of us, or 70 or so of us together, I thought we'd try something together, although we're separate in our individual spaces. So one of the things that I really love about this installation of the deCordova is the enchanted site in which it's located. It has this gentle sloping path, and on one side there's up mossy hill, and on the other side is this downsloping rocky hill, and then there's this dramatic tree, which you can see in the photograph there, and then on the right, and then on the left you can see this great theatrical stone steps that lead up to the project. And so in the course of making this piece, I thought about myths and enchantment and my childhood home, and my daughter, who at the time was 4 years old, thinking about how she would think about our home, sometime in the future, and how she might remember that. So I did a lot of visualization of my childhood home. And so I thought what we could do right now is together, we could close our eyes, and I'll lead you through a short tour of your childhood home. So so I'm going to invite you now to close your eyes. This will take about a minute. So I'd like you to imagine yourself in front of your childhood home, in front of the doorway of your childhood home. And look at that door and notice what color, shape, and material the door is made out of. Look at the handlebar, the doorknob to the door. And then hold on to the handle. And open the door and go into your childhood home. Go into the entry space and then find your way to the living room. And see what you notice there. The furniture, what's on the walls. How does the size of the space of the room feel to you? Is there sunlight in the room? Now walk to the kitchen. And when you arrive in the kitchen, is there a smell in the kitchen that you can recognize? Is there anyone else there in the kitchen with you? And now find your way to your childhood bedroom. And while you're finding your way to your childhood bedroom, take note of the space that you can't seem to quite remember, the structures of how to get to your room that kind of escape your memory. And when you arrive to your bedroom door, look at the door. Is there anything on it? And then note the handle. And then step inside your childhood bedroom. And look at your bed. Are there any shapes, colors, or patterns on your bed? Anything on the walls in your room? Are there any secrets that you can remember now that you're back in your childhood room that you've held on to? Okay, and leave your room and go back out through the door that you entered your house in and step outside. What's the weather like? Okay, open your eyes, please.
That wasn't like a time travel for everyone, I hope. um, that was really interesting because of the ways in which we're living living so intently right now. And I have to say, I've been having a lot of flashbacks just in my day-to-day basis when I take walks. The movement of a tree will like trigger a memory in a really vivid and different way than how it used to be when I took a walk. And I think it's because memory is activated very differently right now when our routine is condensed and contracted, and
Absolutely.
and our desires, I think, are to travel or experience things new, and we feel we can't. I think the spaces of our brain are making that surface. I think about that all the time now when I take a walk outside.
Yeah.
I mean, I think right now with your installation, and I'll pull up another image, you can see the ways in which this installation, and you shared this image because it has this trail, this footprint trail that brings someone into and around the space of Best of All Possible Worlds. It is, in my mind, when I've thought about this artwork as an imprint onto your brain, like the artwork itself prints onto your brain, or one's home prints onto one's brain. And you talked about the kind of magical location of the site. And I had wanted, when I first learned of your artwork, to cite it here because to me, it signals an entrance into the sculpture park. So as people park, one of the ways they can enter deCordova is to walk up these stairs, as you see it on the left, and then have to wind your way through your installation, which is a bit maze-like, and it's not necessarily even that rational seeming as you're starting to walk through it, because things are at an angle and it's not so clear. But then that idea of once you pass through these doors, you're in the park and you're in then a magical different space. And so that's why it had such meaning for me to place it. When we've talked, the collaboration of citing it came about. The additional benefit was that it ended up being a place in the park where the sun sets and rises most effectively. And so that couldn't be better in a way too. So there's something really kismet about, like really right on about this artwork, which is one of the reasons why we've been so happy to keep it on view for the length that we've had. I did want to spend a little more time towards the end, and we have a few more minutes, just to talk about what you've been thinking about in terms of Best of All Possible Worlds now, whether that's about the topic of domesticity now, private life, surfaces, how the meaning of this work
Right.
in particular might have new meaning to you now as an artist who's made it.
Right. So, I mean, I think I'll just briefly touch upon the way it's made with regards to domesticity. So, the way that I fabricated this piece was by using old salvage doors that I rummaged through a secondhand place that had them for sale underneath the train tracks, the subway tracks here in Brooklyn. And I would choose the doors that, to me, had the most compelling stories based upon the scratches on their surface, that had the energy from lives that actually use these doors in their domestic spaces. And then I cast them using a process of vacuum forming that would capture and grab these details, some of them quite fine, into the surface of the casts themselves. And then the process also involved pulling off chunks of wood and paint from the surface of the doors, ultimately destroying the doors in the process, getting these pieces stuck on the door. And so there's that element. And then, like you mentioned, the long axis, the east-west axis of the sculpture is aligned east with the rising and setting sun. So in the morning time when the sun's rising, and in the afternoon when the sun is setting, the casts garner and gather as much light as they possibly can, and there's this prismatic glow from the light that occurs. And so, although there's no one definitive reading of the work, I was certainly thinking about, with use of materials and the forms and the use of light, notions of that cyclical energy of growth and decay and transformation and life and death that I previously mentioned with this piece. But I think that now in the time of COVID, there's this conflict that we're having, especially now with the reopening. This conflict, which is on one hand, we're stationing ourselves inside our homes in order to avoid getting sick and to avoid getting others people sick, and so, but the staying at home, even though it's important to do in order to avoid getting sick, the being at home inside is actually causing mental stress. So the interior aspect of these doors, which have these the rough surfaces with the paint and the wood and so forth, is kind of like at least for me, the interior of the mind, the troubled psyche, both as the individual and as the collective. And on the other hand, the thing that we're doing now is we're reopening. So and the reason why we're reopening is because we are ultimately social animals, and we need to be with one another. And the lack of being able to be with one another has also caused stress. So one of the things that I'm thinking about in relation of this work in the landscape of the deCordova itself is that, importantly, the actual dimensions of the work are 20 feet wide by 50 feet long by about 10 feet high. And that dimension is much larger than the physical objects of the cast themselves. And there's no physical delineation of those dimensions, but it's invisible. And so those objects are now confluent and in conversation with the landscape, with the museum structure, and then also, of course, all the other sculptures as well throughout the sculpture park. And so to me, what that feels like is our need socially to be with one another. Ultimately, we can't be just cloistered within our space. We need to be in conversation with one another. And so for me, during this time of COVID, the ways in which I had thought about the piece have actually transformed.
Yeah, for me as well. I mean, when I think about your piece, I thought about it as semi-transparent, and now we're in a space where privacy and we now all have glimpses through Zoom meetings and other ways into people's homes in a really different way. Normally, maybe in many cases, we'd not be as open and allow these views as typically as we do now. So there's a fracturing, I think, a little bit in that way that we're becoming more used to. But then also this attention in your work in particular that these is so much on the surface, like all the bits of debris and the fragment of a doorknob, that all rests on the surface of what really doesn't have mass within it. And so surface and attention to surface, we're all obsessively cleaning our hands. We can't see what's on our hands, but we know we need to wash them. We have to clean our surfaces, and we're still learning, in fact, like the degree to which we're supposed to be caring and so forth. And so there's surfaces generate to me a new sense of paranoia or concern, or it's just attention all around. And I think that has made me think about your work as well in a new light, that it is so much about those two elements to that degree as well. But I love that idea too, that yes, we are social beings, and that there is a restorative nature to being together, even as we're learning how that can happen in a physical way. And I think by way of conclusion, at least of this portion of the talk, I wanted to end actually with a quote from from the Trustees founder, Charles Eliot, who wrote in 1890, so not far off from the period of time in which your apartment building was built, 1890. Sure. He wrote about advocating for the foundation of a place, like an organization that the Trustees became. And he wrote, as Boston's lovers of art united to found the Art Museum, so her lovers of nature should now rally to preserve these scenes of natural beauty which still exist near their doors. And so he was advocating for the formation of plots of land, like protecting plots of land that were close to Boston that people could still access who were living in the city environment. Maybe there was unhygienic, too crowded, any of these symptoms of industrial life, that people should have access to nature. So he compares, I love this quote because it has so much to do with your artwork as well. He's comparing art and nature, wanting to preserve them, and also this idea that their doors, one's doors, literally in your work existing here, makes these connections, that we need this access as close as hand. So I just think that idea of public health and restoration, both the role of art and role of nature, is one that's really relevant to your work and to your life as both a doctor and an artist.
Yeah, I think all of our lives, actually.
Yeah. Yes.
As an artist and doctor, I think of myself as a mediator
Right.
and an interventionalist. And one of the things that I really love about making work outdoors, and this installation is a case in point, is thinking about how the viewer will experience the work, which I've already spoken about, and really being able to stretch. That's one of the exciting opportunities about making work outside, is, at least for me, is to think about how to stretch the experience of the viewer and the work outside. And it often becomes integral to the work itself. And, you know, I think about ways of disorienting the viewer in relation to the work. And I think mostly about, I think a lot about the time in which people can have to experience work outdoors, which is really so precious. And you know, with regards to restoration and this nice quote, you know, the opportunity to spend time outdoors and to slow down is really so important right now with regards to the feeling of restoration, you know, individually and also for you know, society, you know, at this moment, especially now that we're reopening. And so yeah, I think that quote is really quite nice, and it's you know, it's one of the reasons why it's so important, why, you know, the trustees are preserving land so we can have time to spend on it. And it's really so important why social organizations like the deCordova, like, we really need spaces like this for individuals and for society to restore ourselves.
Yeah. So that was beautiful. We want to spend just a little bit of time in the time we have left to answer a question or two. And Elizabeth, maybe you can read out one or two. We have, you know, I'm trying to keep our time tight, so we have about 7 or 8 minutes if we want to use that.
Yeah, we got a few
questions. And if you, just sorry to interrupt, if you are listening and you do want to write in a question, if you haven't already, you're welcome to. If we receive questions and we don't get to them and you really urgently want to know, we can share them with Saul as well, or with myself. So thank you.
Yeah, so one question from Serena. She was asking about the title of the work and what it meant when you chose it, and whether it has new meaning now that the state of the world is not so great.
So yeah, Best of All Possible Worlds was borrowed from a 16th century philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz, who tried to, or he had this, you know, wanted to explain why so many of these horrible things were happening in the world if God existed. So his theory was more along the lines of, since God was great and omnipotent, and that the world he created had to be the best. And so, you know, really what this is, it's a myth or a story that people could you know, believe into, and one that was a sense of comfort. It's not necessarily one that I ascribe to, but I think that we need stories. You know, we create stories for ourselves in order to make sense of the world and comfort, you know, for ourselves.
Right, because the part of the parable is sort of understanding, if God exists, how could he have created evil, or how could he be made situations in which people suffer? Is that right?
Correct. So now that we've just gone through this pandemic of COVID, I mean, COVID's out there, it's just doing its thing. It doesn't have an aim or a political agenda.
Right.
And so, you know, again, even with this, there are lots of myths that people are thinking about why COVID is there. And ultimately, you know, COVID is just part of nature. It's that terrible, horrifying part of nature that, you know, pulls back the curtain and exposes, you know, ultimately how, you know, vulnerable we are, but also, you know, the strengths that we, you know, have as individuals and, you know, hopefully as a collective together, working together.
That's right. Yeah.
Great. And then another question from Anne. Would you say your practice of pursuing disorder is a form of chance operation, or do you aim for some control?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Is that, so as I said, I work with materials or processes that are methodologies that are ultimately very difficult to control, because I always want the materials to have the last word, and I let materials kind of dictate the path, and then from there I kind of feel my way through what the form and potentially meaning of the work is. Another example of that would be a project that I've been making over the last 7 years or so at Dieudonné, the paper making facility where I work, where I create these cast sheets of ice, and then I push them with my hands into freshly pulled pieces of paper and allow the ice to crack in however it wants to because of the temperature differential, and then add a very special pigment to capture this ephemeral moment in time of the imprints of the melting ice into the paper pulp. So, that's an example of really kind of setting the stage in the studio to allow for things that are out of my control, and then try to, capture that moment in time.
What I really like too in relation to that question, Saul, is that your work harnesses, it's conceptually tight in a way. So you're interested in one element, whether that's water or light. It's very primary. It's sort of reduced and refined, even though there's many other parts to Best of All Possible Worlds, for example. There's many other resonances, that knowing that at light itself, sort of this uncontrollable thing that surrounds us, but also is, that to me is so interesting in the issue of control and chance.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, there are no accidents. It's really being present, setting up a situation where, I'm involved in the choice of the selection of materials and involved in that uncertainty, but then allowing things to unfold as they will, and then stopping them. That's the moment where I stop it and freeze it and contain it, like these, the doors. Ultimately, when I press these doors, every single door that I vacuum formed is different. Some break along the way. There's no way for me to ultimately control how it's going to look. I can only, set up the situation, and that's, ultimately a metaphor for, how life functions, And these doors, just thinking about the question that was asked before about the title of Best of All Possible Worlds and the portal, when you go through any kind of meaningful portal in your life, and you go through and you come back, you're left with this, residual pieces that are from that experience that are kind of stuck onto you. It's changed you in some way. And that ultimately to me is, it's part of the title.
Great. And one more question from Thomas, and he's wondering if you've remained in touch with the shaman you met in the rainforest.
No, that was like a plane ride deep into the forest, and
Wow.
several days walk and a boat ride. So yeah, it was in a very remote area. But I do have, he allowed me to take a photograph of him that I hold very dearly. Yeah, it was a profound experience. In addition to that experience of just being alone in the woods.
Well, I can see we're up on the time that we're meant to talk. I wanted to just see, Saul, if you had any other thoughts about the work. There's so much more to this piece that is important, but if there's anything else we didn't discuss that you had wanted to talk about, I'd be happy to.
Oh, well, I've loved having the piece there and present. And I've gone back several times by myself and with my family to bring it, and brought my daughter back. She's more than 2 years older since the first time we went there. And I mentioned that I'd thought about her in relation to the work when I was making it. And there's most of the doors, there are 8 casts total, and one of the doors, which is her door to her bedroom, I put this color purple, so it's the only purple that's on the door. But one of the things that I really love about the site in particular is the vantage points that people can approach the work, and that notion of disorientation that I touched upon earlier. And when I'm in the studio, part of working with materials that are difficult to control or that are new, or methods that are difficult, I allow myself to be disoriented. And then when I'm disoriented and try to have to reorient myself, those are times where I'm learning. And then it's through that learning process that I kind of feel myself through the making of the work. And ultimately, when I'm exhibiting the work and sharing it with the viewer, those matters or issues have been resolved, but I want to still extend the experience of being disoriented to the viewer. And I want to extend it to them, because when the viewer can be disoriented, that's an opportunity when someone comes across something that's unfamiliar, but vaguely familiar, and then they need to make sense of it. That's really an opportunity for growth and learning and understanding of, of who you are, I think. And so for this sculpture in this site, again, there's, you can approach it from downward, from way below, and you can't really even see the sculpture. And then all of a sudden you're kind of upon it, and then you can, come up the steps, and it may be glowing at a particular time of day. And then there's this other vantage point where you have to walk through this other beautiful sculpture that's there, that, the round tubular structure, walking through someone else's sculpture that's kind of like a portal as well. And then you're coming across this other work. So yeah, there are various ways which you can approach the sculpture, and it's never the same from one approach over the other. And then of course, because it uses the light, you can come back at different times of day, and also different, weather, whether it's sunny or rainy, and every time, it's different. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that I appreciate about having it at the museum.
It reminds me, hearing you say that reminds me of the word unheimlich, or the unhomely, or the uncanny. So that idea of disorientation, that which is both familiar but strange, is such a key one throughout in culture and literature and writing and in art making through the 20th century. And so that carries forward, I think, in your work too, this idea of that strangeness and just defamiliarization, which is key.
It's one of the reasons why I sometimes use objects, the ready-made. I mean, these aren't actual doors. Mm-hmm. They're not doors at all. Yeah. They're the forms of doors. So they're somewhat familiar, but yet there's something off about them. As is, with the boiler. I mean, it's a ready-made object that I took and, transformed it. Yep. Altered its surface, and even the bone paper making work, it has imagery, this organic imagery that might be somewhat familiar, but is different, and abstracted through, color and scale. So I generally don't make work that's completely abstract. There's some tether to something that is familiar, but that is different. And in that disjunct, in that gap, that's the disorientation to some extent that I'm talking about. Like, I want the viewer to close that gap for him or herself. Mm-hmm. And that's the space where, I feel like some kind of learning or understanding or meaning that the person is projecting onto the work can garner for themselves.
It's a great thought for all of us. So I think with that, I'll say we can conclude. Unless there are other pressing questions. And again, we're really welcoming questions that you might have for Saul. If we didn't get to them, we can answer them too, or forward them to Saul, if you don't mind that, Saul. I know you've received a lot of great comments from different visitors who've loved your work. So I think that will continue. And I just hope that all of you who have made it through the conversation and continue to listen, you'll check back in with deCordova. We'll have more virtual events coming up. And we, like I said, we have the park that's now open to the grounds are now open. So look to our website and come back and share your experiences when you do. Thank you. And thank you, Saul, so much. This is really beautiful. And
thank you, Sarah.
This is a step away from normalcy. So the new normal is now where we are. So
the new normal is now upon us. But, it's really, kind of a positive in the midst of all this negative. It's really been wonderful, for my physician self, it's really been wonderful to see people, coming out as the collective, the whole clapping at 7 o'clock mm-hmm. matter. When I'm working in the emergency room, the community comes around and claps for, the providers who are inside the ER, and it's always so moving, but we always clap back, because it's really, it's not just us in the emergency room, it's everybody together, working together to get through this. And, one of the great things now about social spaces being opened up again is that we can, come together and hopefully have integrate in a safe way
Right.
and rejuvenate ourselves.
Yeah, that's the right word for it. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining, and thank you behind the scenes, Elizabeth and Pat, and those who helped us make this possible, and especially to you, Saul. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and it's a beautiful day and a beautiful week.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.